I always know I'm listening to a great sermon when my notes don't look anything like the sermon outline. That's what happened to me this past weekend. Justin Gray was preaching from the text I want to look at today, and I had notes all over the bulletin. I was getting insight from what Justin was preaching and applying it to my life and applying it to leaders. While he was preaching a pastoral message, I was translating that into leadership language. And so as we learn to think like a leader today together, I want to look at the text Justin handled quite well this past Sunday, but I want to take it in a leadership direction. So let's look at Jeremiah 33, very familiar chapter to all of us, but I want to look at verses 12 through 16 and see what this means to us as spiritual leaders. Thus says the Lord of hosts, in this place that is waste, without man or beast, and in all of its cities, there shall again be habitations of shepherds resting their flocks in the cities of the hill country, in the cities of the Shephelah, and in the cities of the Negeb, in the land of Benjamin, the places about Jerusalem, and in the cities of Judah, flocks shall again pass under the hands of the one who counts them, says the Lord. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will fulfill the promise I made to the house of Israel and the house of Judah. In those days and at that time, I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David, and he shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In those days, Judah will be saved, and Jerusalem will dwell securely, and this is the name by which it will be called, the Lord is our righteousness. Now, there is a lot to this, but if we want to think like leaders, there's a way to think that is uncomfortable, but it's all over this text. In verse 12, this phrase, it says that, thus says the Lord of hosts, in this place that is waste. In this place that is waste. In a place that's waste. In a waste place. There's a lot of things we think about of waste. We can think about in the sports world, athletes who have great talent, whether it's in tennis or rugby, or whether it's in basketball or baseball or whatever the sport is, and they have wasted their talent by not trying hard or perhaps by alcohol or drug abuse. So we've all heard stories of wasted talent in sports. Same thing can happen in academia or in business and also in ministry. There are people who have wasted an opportunity and wasted a gifting and wasted a calling and just a waste. And so we can think about this place of waste where things are not as they should be, things are not as they could be. Of course, in this context, this is the Babylonian captivity. This is an invading nation has come in and literally laid waste to the promised land and to the people of Israel. And it's not just a physical waste that we read here. You see that this is agrarian context, and there are no flocks. There's nothing habiting there. Even in the cities, they're desolate. They're devastated. There's nothing there. They're wiped out. And so it's physical waste, but there's also a spiritual waste that has happened. We know that the people of God, and a lot of the waste is because of the failure, as we read Jeremiah 1 through 33 up until this point, and then we read the following chapters of Jeremiah, we see that some of the blame for the waste, the spiritual waste, the wasted spiritual opportunities, the wasted spiritual heritage, the wasted spiritual knowledge that they have far beyond their neighboring nations, it's wasted. And a lot of that is the fault of the priest and the prophets, and as the phrase that comes up constantly here is the shepherds, both physical shepherds it's talking about, but also the spiritual shepherds and leaders. And so the leaders have been a contributing factor to this waste. But we see that it's a physical waste and a spiritual waste. And so how are we to think and how are we to act as leaders when we see whether it's an individual wasted life or wasted gift or wasted opportunity, or whether it is a culture that is laid waste because of sin and compromise and forgetting the promises of God or just disregarding the word of the Lord. In this place here with the Babylonians breathing down and bringing oppression and all the problems that they've already experienced and that they're about to experience. We know at this point Jeremiah is in captivity. Jeremiah, this prophet, is in jail. He's not free to go preach, but he preaches and prophesies anyways. This is a bad situation, and he describes it as this place of waste. But what he says then is, verse 12, there shall again. And then he starts talking about not desolation, but habitation and the things that God's going to shall again. And then in verse 13, again, he says, then these flocks shall again. And he talks about a shepherd coming in that it's been lacking previously. And so this twice shall again. So there's this promise. And when it's a place of waste, what we need is a word from God. More than we need the physical things that we might think we need, but what we need is a word from God. And that's what happens here. There shall again. There's this shall again. There's this hope that's being put forward and put out there in front of the people of God. This shall again. But then what shall again happen? Here it is, verse 14. In this shall again word, he talks about the fulfillment of the promises. God's promises are going to come to pass. Verse 15, in this shall again, he speaks of, verse 15, justice and righteousness. And in a time when there was no justice, nothing but injustice and devastation and all of this invading army around them, there's this shall again, justice and righteousness. Shall again, the promises of God. And then finally in verse 16, this shall again, this hope for the future, speaks about salvation and security. And so we have this hope and this promise in the midst of a wasteland, a literal wasteland, physical, spiritual, in every way, wasted, and yet there's this promise of hope. And sometimes we as believers, we like to take those promises and we like to hold those, and then if they don't happen tomorrow, we get frustrated. If they don't happen a week from now, and a month from now, and a year from now, how about a decade from now? And so while we have this promise of this is the situation, a wasteland, a place of waste. But again, you're going to see justice and righteousness. Again, you'll see the promises of God. Again, you'll see security and salvation in contrast to this Babylonian problem we have. But yet, it's framed by this. Verse 14, the days are coming. Not today, but the days are coming, still in the future. Then in verse 15, he says, at that time, not this time, not right now, that time. And then again in verse 16, when it's talking about the promise of salvation and security, in those days. And so it's shall again, that's the future, but not a short future, not tomorrow or next week. It's still stretched out in those days and at that time and this coming days, but not right now. So often, when we're waiting for the promise of God, we're in a wasteland, we're in difficult situations, we're in missed opportunities, and we're in gifts that don't seem to be happening and prophetic words that don't seem to be our reality. It's just sort of almost an empty hope. We find ourselves waiting, and waiting brings a lot of frustration many times. There's something frustrating and something mind-numbing and hope-crushing about waiting. But there's also something formative. Waiting on the Lord and waiting on the promise of God in the midst of waste, it's not only frustrating, it's formative. There's something being formed in us. There is character, there's strength, there's depth that's formed deeply in the people of God through the painful process of waiting on the justice that we hope for, but we don't experience it now. Waiting on the security when the Babylonian army is threatening to destroy everything that we hold dear. There is a waiting. And again, to think like a leader, I know waiting is frustrating, but remember, it's also formative. And the character and the depth of God is being formed in you as you wait and hold to the promise of God.